Welcome to the afternoon constitutional, and we put it together here and our YouTube channel while it exists for now. We can tell the orchestra to end its presentation of how do we call it? It's the compensating for yourself blues. They're compensating for something this morning. I want to thank you all for joining us. I know it is Take Your Child to Work Day. It was celebrated. Did you expect anything else on Take Your Child to Work Day other than that? I mean, really, come on now, folks. But I do appreciate you tuning in for what we have here today. We have serious stuff to get into. We're going to talk about the debt ceiling negotiations and the deals that were cut that led to the vote last night, 217 to 215, 4 Republicans voting against the bill to extend the debt ceiling and therefore allow now to at least put this bag of some sort of excremental waste onto the desk of Chuck Schumer and see if he stomps on it and gets it all over his shoes. Is it perfect? Certainly not. How many times has something that's come out of a Washington committee been perfect? I'm sure you've heard the expression, what is a platypus? A platypus is a beaver designed by a government committee. So that's coming up for us, and we'll get into it with one of the particulars in the process. Virginia Congressman Bob Good is going to be on with us tomorrow. We're going to visit with Annette Skousen, who is, of course, the folks with Freedom Fest, and Joanne Skousen. I'm sorry, I'm thinking of Annette Kirk, and I'll explain why I'm thinking about Annette Kirk coming up in a little while. But Joanne Skousen, who, along with her husband Mark, put together Freedom Fest, and we'll be there on location in June. From Memphis, Tennessee, and find out more at freedomfest.com. That being said, but I want to kick in with this video that dropped last. Are we not getting the audio of this? Interesting. Let's see if we can't fix getting the audio from it, and then we will. That may fix. All right. They say they have fixed the issue on the engineering side. So again, this tweet came out yesterday evening from Tucker Carlson. Actually, in the first little piece of irony in it, he tweets it just about the time his show would have normally gone on the air. I think something in the area of 60 million tweets. No, we're not getting the audio from this at all. Yeah, we're not getting the audio from it at all. What basically it does is it addresses many of the things that were circulating and leaves quite a few breadcrumbs. He leaves off with the message, see you soon, which I think is that big tell there. But he talks about all the things that are big and important to the world. And if you follow me on Twitter at Joe Thomas WCHV, you've seen the tweet. It has been retweeted also by WCHV Radio 107 WCHV, which is our Twitter handle for our flagship station. Again, thanks to our friends at the Government Accountability and Oversight. So I wanted to then take a moment, since Tucker has been one of the biggest voices, and certainly since the passing of Rush Limbaugh, much has been made about the future of conservative thought. And what is conservative? He was one of the biggest names in it after the passing of Rush Limbaugh. And Rush Limbaugh was different than Tucker because Tucker right now is embroiled. We get several emails on the subject of Tucker Carlson. This particular one says, Joe, what do you say about all the allegations that Mr. Carlson had toxic work environment? And I don't know if they did or not. And there is a message in this. If you are going to be controversial or outspoken, no matter which side of the aisle you're on or which side of the science you're on, everything else, if you're going to be outspoken, we're just going to stay with outspoken, you have to be buttoned up 100%. You cannot, and I know it sounds crazy making because you say, Joe, how can somebody live like that? We've seen what people can do. We've seen what these folks can do and what they will do to people. And I understand that. I understand that it is understandable. But you cannot allow for even the littlest thing. You cannot swear. You cannot use coarse language. You can't be patronizing. You have to be perfect because they're going to come after you for your outspokenness, and they're going to do it simply because you're outspoken. So they're going to do these things whether you are ready for them or not, and so you have to constantly be aware that you are going to be, and the same as if you seek a representative office, you have to treat people nicely. You can't make mistakes with being loose with your language. You get all these things. So if Tucker Carlson fell prey to that, it's going to happen. They're going to bring him up. Do I think it's relevant to his position with Fox no. I don't think it was relevant. I still will go, and if you listen to his tweet, you say you found a new way to get Tucker's tweet here. Okay, so then this is Tucker Carlson from last night. I believe you'll be able to hear it now.
Good evening, it's Tucker Carlson. One of the first things you realize when you step outside the noise for a few days is how many genuinely nice people there are in this country. Kind and decent people who really care about what's true, and a bunch of hilarious people also, a lot of those. It's got to be the majority of the population, even now. So that's heartening. The other thing you notice when you take a little time off is how unbelievably stupid most of the debates you see on television are. They're completely irrelevant. They mean nothing. In 5 years, we won't even remember that we had them. Trust me, as someone who's participated. And yet at the same time, and this is the amazing thing, the undeniably big topics, the ones that will define our future, get virtually no discussion at all. War, civil liberties, emerging science, demographic change, corporate power, natural resources. When was the last time you heard a legitimate debate about any of those issues? It's been a long time. Debates like that are not permitted in American media. Both political parties and their donors have reached consensus on what benefits them, and they actively collude to shut down any conversation about it. Suddenly, the United States looks very much like a one-party state. That's a depressing realization, but it's not permanent. Our current orthodoxies won't last. They're brain dead. Nobody actually believes them. Hardly anyone's life is improved by them. This moment is too inherently ridiculous to continue, and so it won't. The people in charge know this. That's why they're hysterical and aggressive. They're afraid. They've given up persuasion. They're resorting to force. But it won't work. When honest people say what's true, calmly and without embarrassment, they become powerful. At the same time, the liars who've been trying to silence them shrink and they become weaker. That's the iron law of the universe. True things prevail. Where can you still find Americans saying true things? There aren't many places left, but there are some, and that's enough. As long as you can hear the words, there is hope. See you soon.
I own nothing. I I have no privacy, and I've never been happier. That's their goal: is to be in a world where there is no privacy, there is no hope. There is only authoritarianism. And we're being convinced that there are people, based on the number of degrees they have. This is the basic tenet of technocracy that metastasized in this country in the late 1800s. It was building up. It was much of what was going on right before the Civil War took everyone's attention away. There was this development of the idea that there could be an expert class that could be trained and taught and culled and molded, much in the way the European royal families act. If you look at, for example, right now very popular is the British royal family and the duty and the service of Prince Harry and Prince Harry especially because of his abdication of his responsibilities in his flight to the United States, which he then immediately took up, saying how nutty we are, but Prince William as well. And you watch them, the military service, the things they do, and all the appearances for charity and all the things that they do to help in areas where, quite honestly, if the economy of their country was going better, they wouldn't need to be doing all these charitable things, but they do them because it is the duty of station. And the idea of having station. Now, in America, what they want to do is create a democratic oligarchy where we can vote people in and out of the oligarchy. If we don't like you, you can get voted out of the oligarchy. If we like you, we can vote you into the oligarchy. But it'll happen very rarely because it'll take quite a bit of consensus to get that kind of transition from in and out of the oligarchy. You'll have to prove your place. There'll have to be vetting. There'll have to be all these things. And that's what they started to want in the 1800s. Then a lot of their pressure led to the fight over states' rights, independence. And the Dixiecrats actually were a lot of the people who were developing this technocratic class. It was the blue-collar Northeasterners that were saying, hold on a second here, I worked my butt off. And you can't tell me that you're better than me because you have 2 university degrees. I raise my kids, we go to church and all these things. So there was a kind of a schism already in the country over that. But then after the Civil War, conveniently, the technocrats used the Civil War as a fulcrum to develop the very racist ideologies that the Civil War was supposedly fought over. And we wind up with a debasement of everything the United States is. Co-founder of this program, Chris Schoenwald, is fond of saying this is America Mark II. And, we're roughly approaching the 100th anniversary of some of the last stuff, 16th Amendment, 13th. Many of these amendments that took away the authority of the people closest to the citizens all came out of that fear of the Civil War and the secessionists and the slavery and the Klan, and all of these things were used as reasons to, and then we chased down the Klansmen, the same Klansmen who showed back up in Charlottesville, our flagship city. And they showed up here, and they used the Klan and the racism that they had conveniently to create more racism. So Tucker, in his address, and they talk about the real existential things that are going on in our life, brings us back to a point, and this we brought up after he was first let go and it first became obvious, was that he was the most notable voice for conservative thought. Now, what is conservative thought? And Charlottesville, unfortunately, bears the taint of a very confusing view of what is conservatism. And there's a lot of people that get, quote, conservative from a lot of places. I listened to Rush Limbaugh. I watched Tucker Carlson. I watched Bill O'Reilly. I subscribed to The Blaze. All these places that currently we get it. Or I voted for Reagan. My parents voted, for Reagan. Who, wherever you are on the age spectrum. But it all kind of begins with a fellow named Russell Kirk. It actually really begins with one of the first faces to break the British technocratic class. He was a member of Parliament, but he was in the lower house being an important word, the House of Commons. He was a representative from Belfast named Edmund Burke. Edmund Burke was very influential, despite he came from a port city. It was blue-collar, working class, and he represented them in the British Parliament. And when this filing came from their colonies in the New World, he read it, being a lawyer and understanding British common law and British law. He read this filing from the colonies in the United States, written by a fellow from Charlottesville named Thomas Jefferson, and his point was, guys, they've got us dead to rights. Because Jefferson's legal filing, we call it the Declaration of Independence. He called it that as well. He called it a Declaration of Independence because it was a legal filing saying, based on these abuses and usurpations, we no longer recognize the king as our sovereign, as is our right under Magna Carta. Edmund Burke pushed for that and nearly got it passed, but the king had enough powerful or afraid supporters in Parliament, and he was able to send the ships with the soldiers and the armies, and the rest is, as we say, American history. If you talk to anyone who grew up through the British educational system, they'll tell you that the king really sent the B team, and the real fight was going on in India, and that's where they sent the good generals and everything. And we got Cornwallis, and he was a drunkard or whatever, and they all claim that. But so Edmund Burke was biographied by somebody named Russell Kirk, who said, well, what does it take to go out on this limb, to go against the very king, the very avatar of your nation, in order to save your nation? He was curious about this, and he said, let's study his life, and he does it. The book is called A Conservative Mind, and it's not just Edmund Burke, but it's Edmund Burke plus a few other people along the line. If you've never read it, you should. This is where William F. Buckley gets it from. This is where Ronald Reagan got it from. This is where it all begins, and so. What makes a conservative? What is a conservative? And he codified it down into 10 conservative principles. And since Tucker Carlson, unlike Rush Limbaugh, see, Rush Limbaugh invented the medium, so premier networks that syndicated Rush's show really couldn't do the things to Rush that Fox News could do to Tucker, because Fox was a big network before Tucker came along. Talk radio and syndicated talk radio certainly didn't exist before Rush Limbaugh came along in any great degree, so he was bigger than the industry. So Premier couldn't go to Rush Limbaugh and say, "Nah, we didn't like that." Now, if you go back to when he went on to ESPN briefly on their football talk shows, you can see very quickly Rush Limbaugh was treated the same way as Charlie Kirk was when he was in a milieu where he wasn't bigger than his employer. So Russell Kirk, who really is the sun source of it all, codified 10 conservative principles. And we're going to get in a little while with the debt ceiling and some of the things that are happening today. But I think Tucker's point, some of the stuff we're debating, kind of ephemeral. We're doing a history project on our flagship station, WCHV. It turned 90 years old, and we're going through the history of Central Virginia over the last 90 years. And you realize something pretty quickly. The news is the same. I mean, I could take any of the historical, quote, newscasts that we're putting together and just put it on the air as a newscast, and people say, "Oh, that happened last night?" It's wash, rinse, repeat. It truly is the old expression, the only thing you learn from history is that people don't learn from history. So anyway. Reflection and of sacrifice. Third, conservatives believe in what can be called the principle of prescription. This is summed up simply as each generation stands on the shoulders of those who came before us. That's the principle of prescription. Fourth, conservatives are guided by their principle of prudence. In a statesman, Burke writes, prudence is chief among virtues, and public measure ought to be judged by its probable long-run consequences. And he doesn't say that you shouldn't investigate changes and alternatives, but you must view them judiciously and carefully. Call them the seven vices. It's fair to say that I think we should also promote the seven virtues that counterbalance them. Seventh, conservatives are persuaded that freedom and property are clearly linked. Even when come to a vote in the Commonwealth of Virginia, 75% of voters agreed with that premise, even facing a well-funded campaign against it by the Democrats. Eighth, conservatives uphold voluntary community over involuntary collectivism. The idea of if you want to help people be less poor, then go help people be less poor. Don't vote for somebody who says they will help people be less poor. 9, the conservative perceives the need for prudent restraints upon power and upon human passions. If you read the U.S. Constitution, George Mason, particularly in his influence through James Monroe, leads our U.S. Constitution into where this restrictive list, especially the Bill of Rights, comes and vigorous society. And this is the part that really, nobody gets right, is that the greatest agents of change in the United States history have been the conservatives. Martin Luther King, just live up to the words you wrote down on paper. It's a pretty straightforward concept, and Martin Luther King didn't want reparations. He didn't want giveaways from the government. He wanted the government to simply live up to the words that they had written down on paper. So the conservative Martin Luther King Jr. versus the radical Malcolm X was the one who successfully gained large crowds of people saying, yeah, why aren't you living up to the words you wrote down on paper? But change is important in the same way a gardener understands that pruning is important to a tree or a shrub or any sort of gardening, that you need to turn the soil over every now and then to keep the nutrients flowing in them, to prune the wood that may be sucking the life away from a tree. That change actually maintains the permanence of a society, and that the society has to be the preeminent issue in a conservative society, because the liberty of the people that live within the society can only be protected if the society successfully maintains itself. So that's just a little bit of where. And I don't know if Tucker gets his conservatism from there. There are a lot of people in this industry who've never heard of Russell Kirk, quite honestly. And they don't realize it. There are people in this industry without outcasting aspersions that learned their conservatism listening to Rush Limbaugh or reading Tucker Carlson, Crossfire, any of numbers of these things, watching or reading Bill O'Reilly through the years, Sean Hannity and the ilk, which is fine. Many people start in there, but you have to continue down the road. I think we were talking about this with John Whitehead of the Rutherford Institute yesterday. Is you've got to go beyond that. You say, okay, all right, so that's what you think. Why? Why do you think that? And you find books like The Conservative Mind, and you start reading, and you start looking in, and you realize, oh, conservatives are actually about change? Really? I didn't think conservative, but look in U.S. history, and you go back, and the technocrats like Woodrow Wilson are anything but about change. They are not about change. They are about rigid government-mandated status quo. They are the really intransigent ones who don't want any change. And you know them most frequently because they're the ones who are saying, we want change most loudly. We'll even make posters of our political leaders under the premise of change we can believe in. When a Russell Kirk conservative understands that change only comes from the permanence. I mean, if you just took seeds and scattered them willy-nilly across your yard, a couple of plants might grow. But if you intentionally plant them with the right ways and make sure that the pollinators have flowers to work with and will, then happily pollinate your plants and all of that stuff, you will have a wonderfully successful garden. And if you fertilize, you amend the soil, and you don't just leave things to chance, you will have a successful gardening experience. That's where Russell Kirk comes down into this discussion is that his was the idea that you had to constantly be pruning, constantly be working with the plants so that they will grow and be successful there. Now, joining us to take us inside last night's debate over and then the vote for the debt ceiling deal, he is representative of Virginia's 5th Congressional District. He is Congressman Bob Good. Good afternoon, Bob. How are you doing, sir?
Good afternoon, Joe. Great to be with you by Zoom for a change in the afternoon.
Absolutely, and for those who are worrying or they don't have all their friends watching it, you'll hear this again tomorrow on the morning show as well. But Bob, very tight. Several Republicans broke ranks with Speaker McCarthy, and I will start with you voted in favor of this act, of this deal. Take us into why you voted for it, but then folks like Andy Biggs and Ken Buck voted against it.
Well, great question. As you know, Andy Biggs in particular is one of my closest colleagues, one of my closest co-collaborators. Very unusual for us to be on the different sides of a vote. Well, none of us on the conservative side wanted to vote for a debt ceiling increase. We would like to be at a place where we are certainly not doing that, and we've got our fiscal house in order such that we end these debt limit increases. Mm-hmm. But I felt like increasing the debt by a Washington standard of a modest level at 1.5 trillion. It's 1.5 trillion or March 31, whichever comes sooner. Significant there by March 31, by the way, because that will give us the opportunity to have another bite at the apple in an election year when Dems will be very motivated to get this get it behind us from an election standpoint. We'll be able to leverage that, I think, for more cuts next year. But in the immediacy, why I voted for it, we really had truly historic cuts in spending that we haven't had in decades, and reforms in place that will give us a chance to really take a significant step towards fiscal responsibility. Some would argue, Joe, that the REINS Act in and of itself, which is part of this bill, this is really the Freedom Caucus's Shrink Washington, Grow America bill that we released as a proposal a month or so ago. And frankly, the larger conference, Speaker McCarthy, larger conference adopted that, changed the name from Shrink Washington, Grow America to Limit, Save, and Grow, which doesn't quite have the same catchy sound to it, in my opinion. But the REINS Act, which would require a congressional floor vote on any regulation or rule from a government agency, the unelected bureaucratic state, of 100 million with an M, 100 million or more, which again is small by Washington standards, but it would require a congressional vote on that. My friend Mike Lee in the Senate, who we work closely with in coming up with our strategy on this, some of my, including Andy Biggs, some of my House Freedom Caucus colleagues worked with a number of our conservative senators to kind of come up with our strategy. He would argue that the debt ceiling increase it's worth it just for the REINS Act. But when you add to that the energy bill to go back to affordable, reliable American energy, unleash American energy independence again, hundreds of billions of dollars in rescissions of climate, environmental extremism policies, climate credits and climate spending that was in the inflation increase bill. In addition to going back to pre-COVID spending for non-defense discretionary, to put caps of a 1% increase in spending going forward for the next 10 years. Now, we know we can't obligate a future Congress, but at least that's the agreement unless Congress changes it. In addition to rescinding the IRS $80 billion expansion, work requirements, that in itself is huge. We have never had work requirements for Medicaid. We're restoring them for SNAP or food stamps. We're restoring them for some other welfare programs, but Medicaid, this is new. And to have able-bodied Americans age 55 and under to have to work for their federal subsistence is a big deal, not only for cutting spending. It's estimated maybe as much as $30 billion a year, which is small by Washington standards, a few $100 billion over 10 years. But more importantly, or equally important rather, it's the growth of the economy, the productivity, the labor force participation that we need, and helping just to bring folks out of generational poverty, as you know, the culture of dependence. So just some of those reasons why I felt like the better path forward was for us to pass something out of the House, show that we are serious about dealing with our fiscal situation, put the pressure on the Senate and the White House to accept it. And that's why I voted for it.
So let me ask you about this. You were talking about growing the economy. Congressman Bob Good is on with us. We see here in Virginia, the Virginia General Assembly still can't get out of its own way in amending the biennium spending plan. Yet the tax cuts that Governor Youngkin has been able to get in and regulatory reforms that he has been able to get in have led to continued increases in state tax collections. So whenever I hear somebody from the other political party, the tenacious D's, I've started calling them, whenever I hear one of them say, "How are you going to pay for all these cuts?" The answer is, again, and now we have another provable point along the line, that when the economy starts growing more, I think Washington, D.C. is on track to collect nearly $6 trillion in tax collections this year, which means I guess we're going to spend 8 or 9. But I mean, it's not a taxation problem. It's a spending problem. And that's what I think, you need to get that side of it under control. It looks like you do to a degree, but also if we can get the regulations with the REINS Act and the taxation fixed on the other side, then you'll start to see even more revenues coming into the state like we did under the Trump tax cuts.
Yes, I'm obviously more familiar with the specifics on the federal side, although I'm very pleased with what Governor Youngkin is trying to do on the tax side and on the regulatory side on the state level. But on the federal side, you're exactly right. It's actually about $5 trillion for the first time in the history of the country the last 2 years and on track this year. So we're receiving about $400 billion a month. Never happened before in the history of the country until the last couple of years. The Dems, whether they are maliciously, deceitfully being dishonest about it, or whether they are just fiscally, economically illiterate and just misinformed, as you know, they often will go to their common refrain, well, we've got a deficit because of those Trump tax cuts, when as a result of the Trump tax cuts, most of which benefited middle-income Americans, we are realizing record revenues. And you're right, historically, almost always when you cut taxes, you incentivize the right things. You get more of what you incentivize. So, and to Andy Biggs's point, and if we were to go back to, and you've heard me say this on your show before, if we could just go back to pre-COVID across the board spending, not just non-defense discretionary, but mandatory defense and everything, we were spending pre-COVID about $4.5 trillion. which at that point was the largest, most bloated, most wasteful, most excessive, most unjustified spending in the history of the country, we are now realizing, as you said, $5 trillion in revenue. So we would be running a surplus. So at least we're trying to start with it's now, and to clarify, the agreement in the bill is 2022, going back to 2022 spending across the board on the discretionary. But that will allow us, and what we're planning to do is to go to 2019 pre-COVID on non-defense discretionary so that we could keep defense at the current levels. Now, you and I both, I don't want to speak for you, but I think we both recognize there is some waste, some excessiveness, some lack of accountability, some lack of transparency, some unjustified spending in the defense budget. But to try to keep 218, allowing our sort of hyper defense hawk Republicans who maybe are more loyal to the industrial military complex or whose district the spending is in or where their donors come from, that sort of thing. But at one side note as I maybe take a little extra time on the response here, how is it that we spend $900 billion nearly in defense, more than the next 9 countries combined, including China and Russia, and yet all we hear about is how China has passed us by? How have they passed us by if we're outspending? Why is there no accountability for that? Why have we failed every audit on the defense side? Why is there some couple $100 billion in assets we can't find or identify? Why is the flag officers, the 07 and higher, the generals and admirals, the highest proportionage of our troop count that it's ever been in the history of the country, far more than it was in World War II, the most effective military enterprise in modern times, if you can say modern times, 80 years ago? Why is that? And why does no one get fired for failures on the national security or the national defense level like Afghanistan and so forth? So we need to look at defense too.
Well, and you bring that up, and I've said this frequently, Bob, that the Pentagon, though certainly the constitutional mandate of defending the nation is a necessary, but it is a DC bureaucracy just like all the other ones, and we rail about the Department of Education and all of these people who, believe it or not, Bob, we're sending out campaign flyers for, I guess, whoever your opponents may be in the future. I got a press release, we showed it on the show the other day, from the Department of Education, rattling off all of the rhetoric of the left regarding what this Save, Spend, See Act is, the debt ceiling increase bill was going to be. So it's an amazing place, this bureaucracy, as they defend their own jobs. And I guess you can't really blame them for that.
Well, what they're doing, as you know, they're being dishonest. I would imagine that. But with what we have proposed with the spending, or what we've passed out of the House, the spending cuts, while we haven't identified, obviously, specifically some of these things that they're, or most, or if not all these things that the Dems are complaining about, what they're doing is saying, hey, for example, this could mean, and they take the most, emotionally endearing thing to make it sound, for poor grandma or for poor little child or whatever. But the fact is, Joe, let's just go. They talk about the children. Pelosi always says about the children, about the children, about the children. The last time we had work requirements agreed to by Newt Gingrich, welfare reform with work requirements brought into place, Newt Gingrich and Bill Clinton, when Bill Clinton announced the era of big government is over after he got shellacked in the 94 elections, child poverty, overall dependency, overall poverty, food stamp rolls, welfare rolls, all of that went down. Mm-hmm. And there was not the catastrophe and the people starving in the streets that was predicted by Democrats. People do what's in their best interest, and we need to encourage, incentivize the right behaviors, and that's good for the country.
So, Bob, some folks are still saying, well, they get a debt increase of $1.5 trillion. What in the estimates in your discussions with the House Freedom Caucus and the Republican Study Committee, what would an open-ended debt limit increase, which is what President Biden wants, what would that look like? How much more than $1.5 trillion do you think he would do?
Well, let me make this clear. If we had not went through what we went through in January, what the leadership challenge was, what the change the rules of Congress was about, what the reforms to how the House operates, how the Republican Party operates. Forgive me, the buzzing you're hearing in the background. We're getting ready to start votes here soon. I got a few minutes. But anyway, if we had not done that, we would absolutely be getting rolled in the House with a Republican Democrat combined proposal to increase the debt ceiling by the Biden Schumer McConnell requested $4 trillion with no conditions. What's a so-called clean debt ceiling? What a misnomer that is, because that's what Congress has historically done. It would have been said, oh, you cannot hold the full faith and credit of the country at risk. You cannot hold hostage, the borrowing capacity of the nation. But let me clarify, Joe, there will be no default. And we Republicans have to resist the scare tactics and the emergency predictions of catastrophe and recognize and message that there will be no default. Because as you alluded to when we first started to talk here a few moments ago, we've got more than enough revenue coming in to pay the nation's obligations, the interest on the debt, to pay Social Security, Medicare, to pay for defense and the veterans. And if we did not raise the debt ceiling because the Democrats would not accept the bill that we have passed, if the White House and the Senate don't support what the House doing its job with a proposal that's a common sense proposal, none of which, frankly, the conditions that we placed on the spending cuts could be argued against to most reasonable people. You can't defend those, and that's why they're being dishonest about it. But if we did not, if the Dems in the Senate and the White House didn't agree to this proposal, it would force us to cut discretionary spending to conform to the revenue provisions. And so that's what I'm telling Speaker McCarthy time and again. I told him it again yesterday, and I told it the entire Republican conference. We have got to send the message that this is the deal. This is not a negotiating tool. This is the deal. This bill that we passed yesterday is the way we could get to 218. We can't weaken it or water it down, or the 218 will fall apart. This is how you got conservatives to the table who are driving the debate. And if we show nerves of steel, if we show resolve, if we show uncommon valor here, and we show courage, the Senate and the White House will cave, because they will not be able to abide by us not continuing to fund their reckless, woke, harmful, wasteful spending. And so we've got to tell them, take it or leave it, and we're willing to walk away because we've done our job. Little preview. We're also we will be trying to put forth soon a no default bill, which basically says, hey, Janet Yellen, you've got to prioritize the interest on the debt, which is the technical definition of defaulting if you didn't pay the interest on the debt, Social Security, Medicare, our mandatory obligations, as well as defense and veterans. You have to prioritize that, which would basically prevent a default. So the Treasury Secretary and the Biden administration couldn't cause a default by choosing to fund discretionary spending instead of the obligations, which would be the definition of default. And also, Joe, we would default in the future when we could no longer borrow to fund our spending. We could no longer sell our debt. That's when the default will truly happen. And that's why these reforms, these spending cuts are so critical.
So, Bob, what happens in the Senate? Is Mike Lee hopeful that this will actually go to 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue to be signed?
Well, I think you're going to see allies of ours, the conservatives in the Senate, begin to put pressure on McConnell and Schumer to take up this House bill, to bring this House bill to the floor for a vote, to make all Republicans vote for it. And we got 7 Dems running in Republican states for re-election in the Senate. People like Brown in Ohio and Tester in Montana and Manchin in West Virginia, not to mention people like Sinema in Arizona. So you've got a number of very vulnerable Democrats running in red-leaning states or Trump-won states who, are really concerned about their election next year. So we want to make them have to vote on it along with all the Republicans. Mitch McConnell has said this is between us and McCarthy in the House and the White House. But we're going to try to get our Senate allies to help us force a vote in the Senate. My hope would be that those Senate allies will say, hey, we're going to hold up every other piece of legislation until we get a vote on the Shrink America or Shrink Washington, Grow America, or Limit, Save, Grow bill. So hopefully our Senate allies have been trying to help us push that.
So, last one for you, Bob. Are you ready? You said, ready to be brave in the face of the president trying to narrative his veto of this and turn it into, it's the Republicans that are, putting the full faith and credit. They're doing it already. When they're the ones who have created an economy where there's only 3 people paying in for each recipient of Social Security and Medicare, where it used to be 35, 36. Can we stand up to that podium bashing that we're going to get from the left?
Well, coming into the vote last evening, we were trying to buck up our leader, our speaker, to that very cause. Hey, this is not a negotiation step. This is the deal, and we're going to continue to try to help him and to say, hey, we're going to stand strong on this. I do believe that if we could get it through the Senate, which they're going to try to run it out the clock, and they're going to hope that we will cave in the midnight hour. When we're not going to do that, at least he's not going to be able to get a bill through the House again if it's watered down. But I believe if we could get it to the Senate, I believe the president would sign it for all of his predictions or declarations that he would. If it went through the Senate and then his veto would threaten the very thing that he says we can't do, which is to cause a default. It would threaten that because if Janet Yellen, again, didn't prioritize spending, it could threaten that. It's not going to happen because they're not going to do that. So I think if the Senate passed it, the president would sign it. I do believe he would.
Well, Congressman Good, scene set for anything else coming up? I mean, it's like asking, so how is the play, Mrs. Lincoln? But what else is on the plate coming in the next weeks or two in the House?
The next thing on the horizon, big thing on the House side, will be the border security bill. Chip Roy, Andy Biggs particularly ran point on that, being from border states, Texas, Arizona, as you know. And we've got what we think is the best border bill, Jim Jordan being key on that, the Judiciary Committee, along with Mark Green, another Freedom Caucus member, chairman of the Homeland Security Committee. The best border bill that would, Trump had good border policies, but this would put into law those policies so that another president just can't rescind them. It can't, without an act of Congress. And so look for that to come to the floor. Hopefully we're back in our districts next week. And that second week of May, around May 11, we anticipate that border bill being voted on.
Well, look for him around the 5th Virginia District. He is Congressman Bob Good. Bob, thank you so much for joining us. Now go vote on whatever it is you guys are voting on there.
Thank you, Joe. Great to be with you. Appreciate you.
And thank you for tuning in to the Afternoon Constitutional. Again, follow us on Facebook and Twitter, as well as sign up for YouTube alerts. So far, we haven't run afoul of YouTube. Our discussion with John Whitehead didn't get us a warning from YouTube yet, so I appreciate that. And so, again, until tomorrow afternoon at 3, for all of us here at the Afternoon Constitutional, I am Joe Thomas. So long, and thanks for all the fish.